Welcome to the Writing 1 presentation on critical thinking. This presentation will correspond with Chapter 21 in How to Write Anything. There will be some overlap with Chapter 3, but for the most part, if you follow along in Chapter 21, you'll be fine. Let's look briefly at this image I've created to help us understand the argument writing process. And this is really how you should be writing most papers in college. And that is, we have a claim, and you can see that it's backed up by reasons. You give reasons for your claim. And those reasons don't really stand up unless you have really good solid evidence underneath them. So that's how this is built. We also have this idea of assumptions over off on the left, and we're going to be covering that in this chapter. But you can see that those assumptions also affect the claim, and they affect how we view the claim and how we explain the claim and the reasons to our audience, depending on who our audience is. And we talk some about this in relation to audience in the Introduction to Argument presentation. But for this particular presentation, we're going to be talking more about this idea of assumptions. Let's talk about assumptions. Now, in our How to Write Anything book, they get into this in two different chapters, both in the argument chapter and in the critical thinking chapter. In our Introduction to Argument presentation, I said, okay, we're going to cover this in the critical thinking presentation because I don't want to cover it twice. But they do put it twice in the book because it is a fairly significant thing that you need to understand. So make sure you take plenty of time and at least get a good sense of how this is. It makes more sense the more you work with it. If you don't fully understand it first, that's okay. This takes a little bit of work and a little bit of experience. But let's talk about this idea of assumptions, or what some people call premises. Back in Chapter 3, Ruskowitz calls assumptions or premises the principles and values on which we ground our beliefs and actions. And Hacker, in the Writer's Reference book, explains it as a claim that is taken to be true without the need for proof. And that's probably a better explanation here. We sometimes assume that our readers share some principles, beliefs, and values with us, so we don't state it outright. But that's what makes our argument and our claim and our reasons all work together, is this underlying assumption. So some assumptions and premises are just common sense, while others are not shared or common. And there are things that your audience or even your friends, they don't have those same assumptions. Sometimes in our culture, we assume certain things. You know, many people in our culture assume that everybody should get a good education. And so we might have an argument about the best policies to make for an education. But in other cultures, or even cultures within America, there are some people where getting a good education is not really important. So if you're arguing to them that we need to do such and such a thing for school to make a better education for students, the underlying assumption is education is a good thing and we should want a good education. But if they're not agreeing with you on that, then you've completely lost them for your argument about some policy to enact regarding education. We'll get into some more examples here in a minute. But we want to illustrate the idea that we need to consider if readers share our assumptions or not, because if not, then our claims and arguments may not work. Again, claims are based on our assumptions. Here are some examples of claims and assumptions then. The first one is just a little bit common sense and silly, but the second one gets into a topic that some of us use to write about in other papers, and this will help us better understand. So first of all, there's a claim: the weather forecast calls for rain, so carry an umbrella. The claim being that someone should carry an umbrella. The assumption, though, that you're making here is that you don't want to get wet. They're assuming that whoever you're talking to doesn't want to get wet, and you're assuming that forecasts are reliable because you're basing your claim on that, and you're also making this assumption that umbrellas will keep you dry. Now, some of those things are more reliable than others. Certain rainstorms, maybe an umbrella wouldn't do much good. It would get up in the wind and cause more trouble. Sometimes forecasts are not reliable, and some people really like getting wet. So these are all assumptions that, even though for the most part we would say, well, yeah, that's common sense. The weather forecast calls for rain, so carry an umbrella. But it's based on these assumptions that may not be true. For most people, they probably are true. For most circumstances, they probably are, but you have to consider that. Another claim here is Indiana should ban cell phone use while driving based on evidence that cell phone use is distracting and distracted driving relates to accidents. So they're, pretty good argument there, I would say, whether you agree with it or not. It's a claim that someone is making, and a number of students have made this claim in their papers. But the assumption you're making here is that banning dangerous behaviors is an effective way to limit dangerous behavior and encourage safe behavior. And this is something we deal with a lot in society, right? Because different things get banned because they are considered dangerous. Another assumption that I don't put on here, but some people, when making a claim like this, would assume that it is the state's place to tell people not to do something that might be dangerous. Now, again, there are arguments back and forth on that. Not everybody would agree with you. Some people would say, you know what, it's not the state's place to tell people not to do something dangerous. If people hurt other people, that's on them, but the state shouldn't tell them not to do it. So again, these are ongoing issues that you can't assume that people are going to agree with you on. So hopefully this helps us better understand what a claim is. Again, the claim part is pretty straightforward. And then what an assumption is this underlying belief or underlying idea that helps the claim make sense. One of the biggest ways you'll use critical thinking is when you evaluate your sources. And of course, we've had a whole presentation on source evaluation, so I won't rehash that. But this is a good reminder, especially with our argument, that it's important that we keep an eye out for credible sources, as we've been discussing. You also want to think about how they match up with what we've discussed in the argument presentations, that we are using reasonable sources, not overly emotional, or where they aren't able to address opposing viewpoints very well. And you also have to look at the logical fallacies. And we'll have a presentation on logical fallacies, and you want to review your sources to make sure that they aren't guilty of those logical fallacies, even if you generally agree with them.